Almost everyone thinks they already know who Mary Magdalene was, which would be less impressive if so much of that confidence hadn't come from conclusions the text never clearly makes. Somewhere along the way, Mary Magdalene became one of the most recognizable women in biblical history, not necessarily because people carefully studied her story, but because history repeated the same version for a very long time, and repetition has a strange effect on humanity. After enough centuries, confidence starts sounding like evidence, even when nobody remembers where the claim originally came from. The New Testament actually mentions Mary Magdalene multiple times, clearly, by name, which sounds helpful. But humans have always had a remarkable ability to ignore direct information when a more dramatic version already exists, especially if the dramatic version is easier to explain in under 15 seconds. At some point, her reputation stopped coming from the actual story and started coming from layers of interpretation stacked on top of each other for generations. Like historical reposting. Nobody fully checks the source. Everybody forwards the summary. And eventually the summary replaces the person. Mary Magdalene herself was connected to Magdala, a town near the Sea of Galilee. The Gospels describe her as one of Jesus's followers. One passage mentions that 7 demons had gone out from her. And humanity immediately saw that sentence and collectively responded with, "Excellent. We will now create theories for the next 2,000 years." The text itself stays surprisingly restrained. People afterward absolutely did not. Over time, different women mentioned in the Gospels slowly became blended together in public imagination. Stories merged. Assumptions attached themselves to her name. Interpretations kept growing. And the more often the version got repeated, the harder it became to question. Because once millions of people inherit the same narrative, challenging it starts feeling socially suspicious. History really enjoys doing this. A version gets repeated long enough, and suddenly people treat it like it descended directly from heaven, with footnotes attached. Meanwhile, the actual text just quietly sits there in the background like, "That is not exactly what I said." It's the historical version of turning someone into an internet summary, fast, emotional, easy to share, questionably accurate, and unfortunately, simplified versions usually spread faster than complicated ones, because complicated people require attention spans. Humanity occasionally struggles with those, so while the real Mary Magdalene remained present in the text, public memory slowly replaced her with a more convenient version. A version people already recognized instantly. A version artists painted, preachers repeated, movies dramatized, and documentaries narrated with maximum confidence and minimum hesitation. At some point, the interpretation became more famous than the person herself, and this is where interpretation starts to feel a lot like editing, not because information completely disappeared, but because certain details became louder, while others slowly faded into the background. The louder version survived, the quieter version didn't, which meant most people met the reputation of Mary Magdalene long before they ever encountered her actual story. And the strange part is this: some of the most famous assumptions about her didn't directly come from the text at all. Mary Magdalene slowly became associated with stories that were never originally hers, which is impressive, and also slightly concerning. Because at some point, history looked at multiple different women mentioned in the Gospels, and collectively decided, sure, probably the same person. The text itself never creates one giant merged character. People did that afterward, very confidently. Over time, different narratives started blending together. Unnamed women became connected to her. Interpretations overlapped. Assumptions spread faster than clarification ever could. And eventually, Mary Magdalene inherited an entire reputation built partly from stories attached to other people. It was basically the historical version of combining 3 separate accounts into one internet thread, and then acting offended when someone points out the screenshots came from different sources. The strange part is not that confusion happened. The strange part is how long the confusion survived, because once a version gets repeated enough times, repetition starts creating emotional authority. People stop hearing it as interpretation. They start hearing it as fact. History does this constantly. A version gets repeated. The repetition becomes familiar. The familiar becomes untouchable. and eventually questioning it feels more controversial than the original mistake itself. Meanwhile, the actual text just quietly continues existing in the background, still saying what it always said, still not saying several things people confidently added later. But dramatic versions usually outperform careful reading. Humanity has remained extremely consistent on that issue, especially when the dramatic version is simpler, emotional, and easy to summarize in one sentence. And unfortunately for Mary Magdalene, the simplified version spread perfectly. Because simplified stories travel fast, complicated ones require patience. Humanity occasionally treats patience like a personal attack. So while the traditions around her kept growing louder, the actual person inside the text slowly became harder to see. And that is where the real problem started. Not inside the gospel accounts themselves, but in the interpretations built around them afterward. The text was one thing. The public narrative slowly became another. And once the public version became famous enough, people inherited it automatically, without ever checking where it originally came from. Which is how assumptions survive for centuries, not because everybody studies them carefully, but because everybody assumes somebody else already did. At some point, Mary Magdalene stopped being viewed primarily as a person in the story and became a symbol constructed by centuries of retelling. The interpretation became more recognizable than the actual figure, and the irony is difficult to miss. The woman herself never disappeared from the text, only from the version most people remembered. Because the more often a narrative gets repeated, the harder it becomes to separate the real person from the story built around them. And while the reputation kept growing larger, louder, and more dramatic, the real Mary Magdalene slowly faded behind it. While public imagination kept focusing on the version built around Mary Magdalene, the actual text kept placing her somewhere far more important, right at the center of the story, which creates a slightly awkward situation for the simplified narrative. Because the woman history, turned into a stereotype, keeps appearing in the moments where almost everybody else disappears. Mary Magdalene is repeatedly mentioned near the crucifixion, near the burial, near the empty tomb, and that detail becomes difficult to ignore once someone actually slows down and reads the accounts carefully. Because during the moments when fear emptied rooms, scattered followers, and made survival look more attractive than loyalty, her name keeps showing up anyway, quietly, consistently, which is not usually how history remembers her first, and that disconnect says a lot. The strange thing is that many people remember the reputation attached to Mary Magdalene, but overlook the fact that the Gospels place her near some of the most important moments in the entire narrative. It's the historical equivalent of ignoring the person who actually stayed during the crisis, because a more dramatic rumor eventually got better publicity. Humanity has always respected spectacle. Accuracy occasionally finishes second, or fifth, or somewhere behind emotionally compelling headline. Meanwhile, the text keeps doing something surprisingly inconvenient for the popular version. It keeps treating her like an important witness, not background decoration, not symbolic filler, an actual presence inside the story, and the irony becomes almost impossible to miss. The woman reduced for centuries into a simplified label appears in the exact moments where courage suddenly became very expensive. Because crucifixions were not emotionally inspiring public gatherings, they were warnings. Rome designed them that way on purpose. The entire point was fear, public fear, visible fear, the kind that makes crowds step backward very quickly and reconsider every life decision they made that week. And yet Mary Magdalene remains present in the accounts surrounding those events, which quietly challenges the version many people inherited later, because the problem was never who she actually was. The problem was what later narratives turned her into, and once a simplified identity becomes famous enough, it starts overshadowing everything else, even the text itself, especially the text itself, because careful reading requires attention. Simplified narratives only require repetition, and repetition scales beautifully. That is one of history's oldest survival mechanisms. The loudest version travels fastest, the most repeated version feels safest. And eventually people inherit conclusions before they ever encounter the original material directly. which means many people learned the stereotype of Mary Magdalene long before they learned where the Gospels actually place her. Near the cross, near the tomb, near the moment the story changes completely, and history somehow managed to make those details feel secondary, which is remarkable, and not in a good way. Because the more closely the text gets examined, the harder it becomes to ignore the gap between the real figure and the reputation built around her afterward. The most repeated story was not necessarily the true one, it was simply the easiest one to pass along. And that misunderstanding eventually became so large, it almost buried the witness underneath it. It does not take very long for history to create a label. Removing it is the difficult part, especially once the label becomes more recognizable than the actual person underneath it. And by this point, that was exactly what had happened to Mary Magdalene. The interpretation surrounding her had survived so successfully that it almost replaced her entirely. For centuries, the simplified version kept spreading faster than the complicated one. Paintings reinforced it, sermons repeated it, popular imagination protected it like an emotional support tradition. And eventually the reputation became so familiar that questioning it started sounding unnecessary, or dangerous, or suspiciously academic, which humanity usually interprets as, "Please stop ruining the version we already memorized." The strange part is that corrections eventually did appear. People revisited the text more carefully. Historical discussions became more precise. Scholars pointed out where assumptions had merged together over time. But once a narrative reaches enough generations, correcting it becomes like trying to edit a rumor already engraved into public memory. Technically possible, emotionally exhausting, and dramatically less popular. Because simplified narratives survive for a reason. They are easier to consume, easier to repeat, easier to package into one sentence and pass forward without requiring anybody to slow down and think too hard. Humanity has always appreciated convenience, especially historical convenience. The complicated truth usually arrives carrying context, nuance, and uncomfortable clarification. The simplified version arrives holding a headline. Guess which one spreads faster? Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene herself remained trapped underneath a reputation built largely by accumulated interpretation, and the irony became almost absurd. The woman connected to some of the most important moments in the Gospel accounts became more widely remembered for assumptions attached later. The label outlived the person, which is one of history's favorite tricks. A repeated narrative slowly hardens into identity, and eventually people stop asking whether the label was accurate in the first place, because after enough time, repetition starts feeling older than evidence. That is how public memory works, surprisingly often. Not through careful examination, through familiarity, through emotional inheritance, through millions of people repeating the same version, simply because the previous generation already handed it to them fully assembled, like historical copy-paste. And unfortunately, once society attaches a simplified identity to someone, removing it becomes painfully difficult. Because the label eventually stops functioning like information, it starts functioning like emotional shorthand. People recognize it instantly, which means they rarely question it, and the faster the simplified version spreads, the harder it becomes for the original person to remain visible underneath it. That was the real issue surrounding Mary Magdalene, not lack of information, not absence from the text, but the overwhelming success of a version built around her afterward. Some narratives survive because they are true, others survive because they are easier. And history has occasionally shown a strong preference for the second category, which is why centuries later, many people still inherited the label first and only encountered the actual person much later, if at all. Mary Magdalene was not misunderstood because the text completely hid who she was. The misunderstanding survived because the simpler version became easier to repeat. And once a simplified narrative becomes emotionally familiar enough, humanity will defend it with remarkable confidence, even when the original material remains fully available the entire time, which is exactly what happened here. Over the centuries, public imagination slowly built a version of Mary Magdalene that became larger than the actual figure inside the text. Different stories blended together. Assumptions hardened into tradition. Repetition created certainty. And eventually the interpretation became more famous than the person herself, which is a surprisingly common historical outcome. People inherit conclusions long before they inherit context. That is basically civilization's favorite shortcut. The strange part is that the Gospel accounts never actually erase Mary Magdalene. Quite the opposite. She remains visible throughout critical moments of the narrative. Near the cross, near the burial, near the empty tomb. Near the moment, fear emptied rooms and certainty disappeared for almost everyone else. And yet somehow, centuries of retelling managed to overshadow those details with a far more simplified public image, which says less about the text and far more about how humans process stories. Because humanity does not always preserve the most accurate version. It usually preserves the version that is easiest to emotionally organize, the version easiest to summarize, easiest to teach, easiest to repeat without explanation. And unfortunately, once a reputation reaches that level of familiarity, correcting it becomes extremely difficult, not because evidence is missing, but because emotional repetition is powerful. After enough generations, the inherited version starts feeling older than the source itself, which is deeply ironic when the source never stopped existing in the first place. It was always there, still readable, still accessible, still quietly saying exactly what it originally said. Meanwhile, the louder narrative kept spreading across centuries with the confidence of a person who read half an article and immediately started a podcast. And the more often the simplified version got repeated, the more the actual person disappeared underneath it. That was the real tragedy surrounding Mary Magdalene. Not disappearance from history, replacement inside history. Because she did not become forgotten, she became overwritten. The woman connected to some of the most important moments in the gospel story ended up remembered primarily through assumptions the text itself never fully confirms. And the gap between those two versions became so normal that many people stopped noticing it entirely, which is what makes the story surrounding Mary Magdalene so strangely modern. It is not just about religion, or history, or tradition. It is about what happens when repetition becomes stronger than attention. When public narrative becomes stronger than careful reading. When people inherit labels faster than they inherit truth. And maybe that is the most revealing part of the entire story. Mary Magdalene was never buried by lack of evidence. She was buried underneath versions of her that were simply easier to believe.